Poiesis Live. We're joined by my friend Isaiah Freeman. He
Yep.
is an educator by day and a philosopher of education. In his spare time, he runs the Substack in Souling Education, as well as the Ladder of Poetry and Essential Poetry. We've been kind of chatting for the past few months. He's a poet as well, and he's got some interesting ideas about different ways of thinking about and categorizing different sorts of poets. So Isaiah, welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here talking to you.
I guess one of the things I was going to just sort of generally state to sort of gauge your reaction and see how well I have it in my mind. The way I understand it is you've sort of come across in thinking about a large group of poets. You're obviously well read, and you're obviously a fan of poetry and have read lots of different sorts of poets. It seems that you've sort of established for yourself something of a taxonomy of poets. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah. Noticing some of the deep patterns in the field of poetry, and as I was explaining to Caleb Flores, who you passed on to me recently, what I was saying to him was that it's how do I explain this? Poets are the most articulate of the artists because it's the medium they work in. So every artist in every medium is going to have some kind of philosophy or poetics in how they approach their art and the place that art fulfills in their worldview.
Mm-hmm.
But because poets are so articulate, it was easier to see how the differences and the similarities in poetics across this, like a really large number of them, and then to realize how they interlocked with each other like puzzle pieces. And that's what ended up sort of leading to that fourfold schema of the sentimentalist, the scholar at the exoteric half, then the censor and the scribe in the esoteric half. And once I could see how they all kind of interconnected in one sort of unfolding sequence of development, and that there was what I sort of refer to in one of my essays as a dialectical logic. We move from the subjective to the objective to a fusion of the two into the transjective of the logos, which is the censor, and beyond. And there's like a clear progression. Once I figured that out, it was a bit like a circuit board, sort of like connecting, and then the lights kind of starting to glow, as it were. But that's my initial response.
When you say that poets are particularly articulate with respect to their understanding and expression of their worldview due to the nature of the art itself being based in a linguistic medium.
Yeah.
Do you mean that poets are more able to define and explain that to themselves and others outside of the poetry, or in the poetry itself, or both?
Yeah, definitely both. It's interesting because poetry is also one of those things that, in a way, the poets themselves and the tradition of poetry is somehow inherently like transgressive. So, like philosophers typically or stereotypically can be quite analytical
Mhm.
and it can be quite confined, but like poets can include all sorts of things in their poems, and that the poets themselves are kind of a bit more unconventional. They don't want to keep everything compartmentalized and discrete. They want to bring their whole worldview sort of into being through language,
Mhm.
and the shared worldview they want others to inhabit as well. So like it's a uh, I would almost go so far as to say that it's like sensing poetry, the most truly profound, like Wordsworth is probably a good example of this. And I just read to my creative writing students at the school I teach at lines composed above Tintern Abbey,
Oh, of
which I
course.
love.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just so interesting. Like Harold Bloom has a line when analyzing that poem where he said that essentially Wordsworth is quite interesting as a poet because he started out, he almost approached poetry in this as though it was a tabula rasa, like a blank slate, and he just did whatever he wanted with it. He spoke not only more directly than others had before, but more about the the lives and experiences of ordinary people, but also of his spiritual experiences
Mhm.
in a much more free way. So there's like, and that transgressiveness is kind of what I think Bloom would also call inventiveness. Um, and yeah, is any of that?
Oh, yeah. Like, well, with Wordsworth, I mean, the whole idea of the spontaneous overflow of, emotion recollected in tranquility, right?
Mm,
It, and this is sort of characteristic of the era, in which he was writing, the Romantic era, where revolutions were happening, monarchies were being tried, in favor of people wanting a more democratic systems. And you see in him, it's like kind of like a ballad, but then
mm,
but then he's giving voice to these characters, but it's in a style that it's like, where is the style coming from? But then
mm.
it'll also be like, I mean, depending on the poem, but it'll be incredibly like intimate and specific to Wordsworth and his style. Like
Yeah.
yeah, and that's interesting in that idea of it being a tabula rasa. Just yeah, the freedom, the liberty, to play with all of these styles. And
And could I
yeah, please.
So, so it seems interesting to me because I think the poet kind of has a really interesting function in society, and I would say that it's analogous to the bard in the Age of the Druids,
Mhm.
based on what I've been able to read. Uh, they kind of bring together into their being uh, they kind of embody something that society doesn't do naturally by itself. Like we've got some analytical philosophers who can abstractly compartmentalize everything, but it can be it can't it's not always embodied. You can have people who are very emotional, but that's not quite what the poet does. The poet's almost like bridging into all these spaces, and he's never one of them. And I'm just kind of like throwing a few things out here, see what lands, because I'm trying to sort of figure it out as we go. Um, there's also like a witnessing function that they do, like they're more conscious of, like they hold more in their being, um, and they do that in a way that's more conscious that other people, uh, maybe in society generally, struggles to do. They struggle to be embodied, experience, be in their consciousness somehow. I don't know how to. I feel like I'm on the thread of something. I don't know what it is though.
Yeah, and I think you were really getting into something when you brought up the transjective. Let me see if I can
Mm,
pull this together, because you and I have talked about this in other conversations that we've had, where oftentimes when we're writing, we're trying to, or at least I said this, I think that you kind of assented
yeah.
that it was similar for you. I There is something that I'm trying to behold or comprehend or apprehend,
Mm,
and I'm not quite certain what it is, let alone how to express it. But somehow in the activity of writing, I'm working through or um, sort of metabolizing like the breadth of these ideas. And I think that the transjective is interesting because when I'm doing that, whether or not I have any intention of sharing that poem later with someone else, it's sort of in the nature of the composition that there is the potential for a reader to apprehend this.
yeah.
And then that's where an even uh, greater potential for emergence of that mystery um, is aspired toward, or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. So I've been writing a long essay recently, and it's so long uh, and it's got so many different tendrils in it that I'm struggling to bring it to a close. But at one point, I talk about how it it's almost quite a Christian task in the original sense of Christ, which was to be a not just a follower of the logos, but a minister of it. Like we're trying to minister that to people,
Hmm.
and I think that is what the communion symbolically was originally meant to be. We're taking the logos into ourselves and we're opening ourselves to it, to the
Hmm.
transjective. Um, we're trying to like with our poems. There's a way in which, as you just said, uh, it's got it's got the potential for to meet others. It's like we're trying to. It's so there's so many layers to it. We can tackle it from a few different ways, but like it's kind of like what we're doing is we're trying to birth the medium through which other people can flow into a connection with themselves, reality, with the poet, um, and the logos, which is all of that. Um, yeah, I don't know how else to put that.
There's a
We're
lot.
trying
There's
to,
a lot of juice
yeah,
there. The
yeah,
I mean, just to start with, I mean, the whole idea of the logos, right, is like
mm,
this idea that there's like some kind of symbolical, grammatical order, or um,
yeah,
potential for pattern just in creation itself from nothing, like th- that sort of already implies that every instance of expression and manifestation of embodiment and being in the cosmos is always going to be an iteration of this thing that is always already not
Yes.
able to fully be represented within the logoi or logismoi or whatever
Yes.
the smaller logo is. And then, yeah, that idea of while you were talking, I was thinking about going back to Wordsworth, who we were already talking about. He had that, intimations of immortality, and that
Yes.
idea of intimation where it's like there's nothing could be more private than me with pen and paper alone, and yet at the same time I am confessor and professor,
Yeah.
and so I'm all of these things. And I think that whole sort of transubstantial motif that you're riffing on is very apt, because you're taking into yourself the your inner experience and working with material that's already present. So, but you're taking it in, and becomes a sort of indwelling where the phenomenal world is taken in to your mind, which hopefully has been properly descended to your heart through spiritual practice.
Mhm.
And from that place of taking the phenomenal world into the inner psyche, touch with the logos. That's the fire, the divine spark. That's like the dream. And then
And
spirited, right? When spirited, inspired, then it grows
y-
into a flame.
yes, 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 yes. I agree with everything you just said. So that's quite interesting because I wonder, like, so this is what I actually couldn't get to in my essay, and I was wondering if we were going to get to it today, and we've just gone straight into it, which is uh, how how does this kind of repeated exposure, that's not quite the word, immersion is probably closer in the logos. How does that, what does that afford? Because I think Blake would say that not opposed, because that's like that's making a binary that it's more a tonus. There's a tension
Mm-hmm.
between what Blake would call the selfhood, which is separated, believes itself separated, and just
Mm-hmm.
like Jung says, the ego actually has a function. It's not like this thing that's evil that we need to destroy.
Yeah.
Um, and then the logos, which is almost a superconscious thing, um, where the ego gets for that timeless moment sublimated, and it essentially becomes just like a melody can become a part of a symphony, and the local part of it can then assume all of the meaning of the whole which it is a part of, and it becomes one thing with the larger reality. What does that afford the selfhood? I haven't been able to drill quite down into that, because I think for both of us and for other poets with similar inclinations, there's a really deep sense that it's somehow spiritually important, not just for our own practice, but to try and afford that for readers. Um,
Yeah.
and it is.
This worked into something that I was thinking about possibly talking about too. So I think that, I alluded to, hopefully having the mind properly descended into the heart through spiritual
Yeah.
practice and like virtuous practice. Like, I think that's really essential, especially when you're in your taxonomy in the sensing and the scrying realms, because if you don't have that rootedness and that piety, discipline, devotional practice, it can be it like I don't think Blake could have done what he did if he had not had that pious and like just beneficent,
Yeah.
loving like
Yeah.
self. If he didn't have that, he could have easily just gone mad, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so as far as what it affords, I almost wonder if that's not for us to know. Like maybe that's like kind of God's business. Like we're called to do what we are called to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And are we going to do that, or are we going to resist? I mean,
Yeah. Well, so I mean, for me, it's interesting because and I genuinely do not know. It's been an extended aporia for me, that question. Um, but there's potentially a way. It's like a guiding principle of mine that if I can understand something properly and without rushing it or collapsing it and collapsing the nuance and complexity of it, if I can actually grow into, as Rilke says, grow into the answer to that question, maybe that could help me to understand and perform my task more skillfully in a way.
mm,
And again, that's an aporia, maybe not, but yeah.
that seems really right. Like I mentioned earlier before we got live that I was reading Owen Barfield's Poetic Diction, and it's really helped me as a writer, not because of like practical advice about word choice or
Yeah.
poetic construction or anything, but in that the way that he thinks about the way that meaning happens. And of course, Owen Barfield, he's very attentive to the fact that words change their meaning over time. And, different things are going to have the different texts are going to have different poetic responses for different readers. And
Mm.
like that, that's all. There are a lot of variables that go into that. And that has helped me because it's instead of putting so much emphasis on what are the requisite skills to complete this task legitimately and, such that I could be recognized as having talent or skill. Instead of thinking about it that way, it's more like, oh, it's more about finding the state of consciousness that I'm trying to communicate and perceiving that
Totally.
as clearly as I can and as fully as I can with as
Yeah.
much sensory interaction as I can, and then just conveying that as aptly as possible. And
Uh,
that gets because anybody can look at writing from the past and assess what are the rhetorical devices, where are
yeah.
they using assonance or sibilance or these types of things, and you can analyze it. You can pick apart the rhyme and the meter and all that stuff. But if you're going to go to try to compose something with those things front of mind, you're just not going to
No.
be able to compose. It's just not how it works.
And I think, yeah, you're touching on something that feels like almost the central practical point of the whole ladder of poiesis system, like how it actually hits where the rubber meets the road, as it were. Because I think the lower two stages, the sentimental poets and the scholarly poets, have a tendency to think that and then that, well, first of all, that it comes from just feeling and finding the right words, and then using all these techniques, the craft, the tradition, the aesthetics, all of that. But I think it's really like the greatest art is all about consciousness, where you're coming from in consciousness. And it's why, even though someone like T.S. Eliot in The Wasteland, his poetics was all about getting rid of the personality. In other words, all the subjective, sentimental stuff, because he was pushing against that, because he was very, I would say, in the scholarly stage. But despite, and so what he did was he tried to use a fragmented sort of, I would say, poetics, a fragmented approach to imagery and everything like that. And he was very conscious of the craft that went into it. And Ezra Pound helped him with that. But at the end of the day, I still very much get a sense of his, in that particular poem, of his personality and the place in consciousness where he was coming from, which is a conservative, middle-aged man. And so, like, it's so weird to me. We've almost culturally we've inverted how reality actually is, because the art for me isn't necessarily about the words on the page. The art for me is always about the underlying consciousness.
Yeah.
Because if I can get in touch with the underlying consciousness of someone like Blake and even glimpse it or sense it indirectly, that for me is like what actually is most spiritually nourishing and transformative. And so the words should serve the consciousness in a way rather than the other way around.
Yeah. And my favorite poet is Samuel Taylor Coleridge, not because I think that he wrote the greatest poems, and not even because he wrote my favorite poems, but rather because as a mind and as a soul, I want to be with him. Like, I'm fascinated by him and feel a kinship with him. And he leaves traces of it. There are traces of his genius in the Mariner poem. There are traces of it in Kubla Khan and Christabel and in Dejection Ode. But he never actually, as a poet, he never actually got there poetically. I don't think he ever reached the sublimity that Wordsworth did in anything he composed. And he knew that. And part of it had to do with an opium addiction and all this other stuff. But, you know, I mentioned Owen Barfield earlier. Another thing I like about him is he's got this book, What Coleridge Thought, which I'm reading that as well. And it's just a fascinating thing that, you know, Coleridge did so much studying, but never quite left the essential document, the authoritative statement, such that another scholar like Barfield could go combing through all of the miscellanea to try to get the essence of that thought and state it. And he mentions in that book that Coleridge was always just chasing the pure truth itself, and he only wanted the truth as truth.
Yeah.
You know? And so literary arts were sort of, they were secondary consideration for him, you know? And I think there's something beautiful to that. And then that kind of makes me wonder about like somebody like Shelley after that, because Shelley had very similar kind of inclinations. He was pursuing something ideal, though Shelley was famously an atheist, and I don't know what the numinous thing he was chasing was, if he doesn't want to describe it in theistic terms or whatever. But
yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, it makes me think of just to return to that point about poets and artists that are inspired being a kind of the ministers, like it's a priestly almost profession in a way, because it's but by its nature you can't do it in a compartmentalized, disembodied, rote artificial way, which I think just the general consensus would be that there's a tendency for real priests to slip into that at times. And just like I suppose there's a tendency in some poets to not rise to the level of committing their being to the process of essentially refining their consciousness, such that it blends and merges with the logos, and the reader is put in touch with that. Um, it's like um, it's like that moment where you become the logos, and through that moment you help the readers of your poems to become the logos for that moment, for that brief, like timeless window when they're just in another space. Like that is, it's just that's so strange to me what that is. It's like like an at one-ment, like everything gets at one, um, and there's suddenly no separation, the separation of selfhood from everything, living in a chaotic material world where everything's bouncing against one another in this harsh game of survival of the fittest and everything like that. And everything's just like seen as it really is. The doors of perception are cleansed, to use Blake's language, and there's a marriage that's kind of consummated in that moment or something.
Yeah, and I just think that it's part and parcel of being the embodied beings that we are in our particular neural, bodily, corporeal state, that we can't live in pure logos. You know, it's like the whole idea of theosis, you know, that Christ logos became man so that we could become gods. That's not to say that on earth we become infinite beings, and or that we become infinite being self, because we're individual finite beings on earth that, you know, live in, you know, specific material, social, physical configurations, you know, and that's how we experience our part as logismo or logo or whatever. And so it comes back to your question about like, what is it that we're trying to do when we're going toward that state? Like, because we can't be trying to ultimately solve all mysteries and like reveal truth as such in such a way that we are no longer what we are. So therefore it has to be, going back to Eliot, like a repetitive paraphrastic thing, over and over, repeating, cycling, like the seasons. You know, it comes forth and it recedes and it circles, and it's that is nice when it comes back to your analogy about composition too, because there's a, you know, the musical framework, the piece reaches its crescendo, it concludes, you know, and then all is finished, and the audience goes out and uses the restroom and mills in the lobby and goes home, and then next season they have orchestra tickets again.
Yeah, and then I suppose, to return as you are to the question of what it affords, I suppose that there is, in some way that's can't really be calculated, an increasing sensitization to that participatory state of being. just a slight increase in fluency, or with that, or a slight maybe more openness to that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And that, yeah, I thought about that too while you were talking. It seems like the, I mentioned, virtue and piety and things like that, and
yeah,
how I
yeah,
think they're crucial to being able to get in touch with that inspiration without losing your coherence, without losing your sanity, your grip, And I think along with that idea, I think the best thing that can be done with that new grace and fluency that you um, gain from that experience of clarity, I think, is to be kinder. I
yeah,
mean, William Blake is also said to have been extremely kind to everyone who knew him,
yeah,
and this is how
yeah,
people describe saints, as just being
yeah.
so loving and caring and so responsive.
Absolutely. And Wordsworth even talks about that in the Tintern Abbey poem that I can't remember the exact line, but he owes to his experiences as a young man in nature, in which he was immersed in nature, and he all but uses exactly that language of immersion, like he says, it haunts him like a passion. Um, that is, he owes to them the kind, like basically something that made him kinder and impacted the actions that would be considered trivial, like the everyday sort of things that you do. It somehow made him a better man, um, in a way that even he couldn't quite pin down. He just had some kind of intuition that that was right.
Oh man. And bringing it back to Coleridge, this feels so good to be able to say this in public and out loud to my friend. Like, so, Coleridge had the idea that the imagination was our like primary faculty of apprehension, and it connected us to the divine mind, the repetition of the eternal I am, appears in Exodus, and Jesus Christ repeats it in a passage in the New Testament. And that co that co-creation that we participate in when we're in touch with that faculty. Coleridge had this poem called the Dejection Ode, where he starts off at the beginning of the poem. He's disconnected from the world. He can see things, but he can't feel them. And through the poem, he goes through and he does like some sort of depth psychology sort of stuff. And he gets to a still point where he had just recalled an early childhood trauma, and he hears the silence, and he's able to like gradually come out of it. But earlier in the poem, he says things like, we receive but what we give. And he talks about, oh, let me see, I've got these lines memorized. I'm surprised they're not coming to me more quickly, but he says, I may not hope from outward forms to win the passion and the life whose fountains are within. And anyway, all that is to say is that somehow his quieting of his ego mind, which like you said, the ego isn't necessarily bad or anything, but sometimes you need to quiet. that aspect of your intellect to get to a spiritual sense, like in quieting all that poet ego mind, got to that point, he was able to then like re-enter the world. And anyway, I'm just relating that to his theory of the imagination and that idea of participation, co-creation in the cosmos. That's like the depth that it sounds like Wordsworth was describing that he gained from having been immersed in nature. And in my own life, I'm kind of starting to, as I work with some of these ideas and really have them deep in my spiritual practice. And I also spend a lot of time in nature, not really wilderness, it's, always a highway within a mile or two, but nevertheless, I'm around rivers and creeks and streams and, woods and stuff. And the more time I spend, not just reading, but like reading deeply and reading before bed, so that my mind is getting in the cadence of language at the unconscious level, and in all my prayer and religious life, like it's in spiritual life. I'm starting to feel that, that sensing of like the way that trees distinctly shape themselves as a response to temperature and moisture, and like those types of mental experience that precede language, but you tune it out if you're not in the habit and practice of spending a lot of time in silence with them, and little things like I bought a bird feeder and little things like this. Hey, very long riff there, so I hope there's something beneficial.
Oh yeah, no, there is. There was a lot there. That was really interesting. I was enjoying going on the trip you were taking me on. That, yeah, there's it's interesting, yeah, because that, yeah. So I think we've kind of like answered one aspect of I think what it affords. It's like the capacity for what we can call like a vertical intimacy with the logos actually seems to afford like a horizontal intimacy, as it were, with the people around us, the world around us. Perhaps it's like it's more like the ego. I don't want to say it becomes porous because that can imply it being not as strong, but there's like an ability for the psyche to just lay the emphasis not on the selfhood but something else for a while, and that almost seems like a really essential. That's probably I feel like we just defined the essence of love in a way, to
Sure,
lay
absolutely.
the emphasis on something else for a while,
Absolutely.
as it were. And we kind of let the vibration of that other, whether it's the tree that's growing or a friend, to to almost adopt that vibration in your own being, as it were. I don't know how else to put that.
So I was thinking about that as you mentioned that, like the openness and the receptivity that make you capable of experiencing that empathy, that caritas, that eros, that love. That is, so like as an organism, we can't always be open to everything because that level of vulnerability, it's just not sustainable. We will cease to exist.
Yeah.
And I was thinking that's sort of an analog for our conversation about like what we're up to in this pursuit of being in touch with the logos, and why it is that we're called to do it, and what function does that serve, and what purpose, and what is the nature of that calling. It's like it's the same concept. You can't constantly be in pure logos, because then you're no longer a being. And
Yeah.
as being, so it's the same concept with the love thing. And I really like that idea of horizontal and vertical. Um,
Yeah.
uh, and it begs. I was also thinking about, like, well, what if you really could just really be completely open to nature? Well, then I think about, like, that guy in that documentary who went out in the wild and got eaten by a bear or something, or like,
Yeah.
and so I guess I was thinking, but maybe you could just do it and not just immediately meet a tragic fate. Like, let's say you could just leave and just live harmoniously and be completely open. Then I was thinking, well, then you're no longer pursuing the artistic, poetic um, element anymore. And then so that led me to consider, is there a necessity for the poetic enterprise, the fictive enterprise, the creative enterprise, the imaginative artistic enterprise? And it seems to me, like I mentioned earlier, well, maybe we're just called to do it. Maybe we're actually, we're called, we're more or less it's a commandment of us, by a force larger than us.
Yep.
Well, but then as I was considering your response just now, I was thinking, well, what if it's a moral duty? Like, if every age needs its prophets and poets
Yes, yes, yes,
because it
yes, yes.
can't metabolize the forces that are at work on it, and so it needs these
That's so
figures.
good.
Perhaps it's a moral imperative that you must do it.
So there's a line in there's a I went so there's some Tibetan Buddhism
Uh-huh.
that talk about certain initiation practices, and that there are masters of the wisdom. They refer to them as the ageless wisdom, which is the best title to have, master of the ageless wisdom. And what they do in initiation is they essentially, because they talk about how the light of they literally use the language of the logos. The light of the solar logos is too intense for a person to take the full brunt of. So they almost act as a prism, and they refract the light, they mediate it into a way that becomes digestible for the person undergoing the initiation. And I suppose poets have an analogous function in a way. The phrase you used was I thought was perfect. It's like the forces that are for whatever reason hard for most people, for society in every age, as you said, to digest, um, need to need to come through to us in a way that's been mediated, made manageable, humanized, embodied, all of that, and that gives it a human aspect that everyone else can then bridge into.
Mm-hmm.
Does that land with what you were saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And it gets to the that whole problem of, well, not necessarily a problem, but that condition of, every era, like cyclically everything happening, and then always iterating and reiterating the same essential the same essential. I hesitate to call it a concept or an idea, but the same essential
Yes.
numinous,
Yep.
must always be translated every age over and over again, because it is what is the conduit to that sort of depth perception that we were talking about earlier. And so, and that the ability to access that depth consciousness is just, it's kind of our birthright. And it's what facilitates like the fullness of being, and it's
Yeah.
it's an honor and a privilege as well as a duty to try to assist in conveying that.
I think so, because I think poets and artists who are trying to, whether they know it fully consciously or not, facilitate that marriage between society, the separated selfhood, and that what that depth perception opens onto, divinity, the logos. They sense that, like, I'll speak quite directly here. I think for me, why do I want to do that is because I can sense that, like, people, there are levels to suffering and levels to the subtlety of the suffering. And we often have to, a lot of people are working on relatively surface levels of trying to help people out of their suffering, which is good and needed. That's needed too. We need to work at the level of the symptom also. But I can see how there's so much suffering that comes from a cause that's so subtle that most people don't even know it's there because they haven't tasted anything different.
Mhm.
And that, the separation of the selfhood from everything, the fact that we're not at home in the cosmos, that we are radically different from everything around us, and we don't fit in a way. There's no home here. It's a wasteland, to use Eliot's words. And but then in those moments when you're at one with the logos, and it's that timeless thing that takes us out of our, as Wordsworth says in the Tintern Abbey, like where we're laid asleep in the body and become a living soul.
Mhm.
That's like the perfect phrase for it. And I would also say the soul is metaxu, like it's between, which is what the logos is. It's the force that's like this marriage force that's like drawing us into that at one-ment. And that is the in that moment the amelioration of like the deepest, or one of the deepest forms of suffering, and it's what enables us to go on living in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, that the fact that it's an in between is so fascinating, because it's at the same time that it's evidence of the fact that our spiritual selves are of some different nature. It's also the thing that animates life.
Wow. Very, totally. Totally. That's such a great connection. Totally. Because the logos is the thing that holds it all together. And it as Blake would say, you know, that that is the reality. And that's what he sees in the wildflower, in his famous aphorism on the
Yeah.
wildflower. Yeah. Um, like it is reality, and it's a reality that's present through every age because it's reality.
Yeah, and I guess I'm just gonna repeat myself, but yeah, it's the privilege and the honor and the duty to
Yes,
apprehend how that manifests within our
y-
particular age.
yes, yes, and I suppose there's just for me, I think there are of course grey areas, but generally speaking, my sense of things is that it's pretty there's a clear cut line, and I think Christ even says he came to bring a sword and not
Yeah,
peace
yeah.
uh, between the false prophets who, instead of putting people in touch with the divine, essentially the logos, in this participatory way, where they're basically becoming, they're allowing the force, the magnetism of the soul to work through them to draw other people into the soul,
Mhm,
into that union. There's a difference between, I would say that's that kind of creative kind of person, individual prophet, um, and someone who's trying to put people in touch with something that is still somehow separative. And we've touched on this before. Like there is, I mean, at the beginning of this conversation, we brought up some priests who, instead of doing that, and Blake really disliked these priests, would erect a empty shell of dogma because they haven't got the sense and the essence of the thing working through them, and that can be at its worst destructive and actually get in the way of, like, it can traumatize people and keep
mhm.
them from accessing that state. At its best, it doesn't quite work, but it gives people a language that they can then, later down the track or in their own practice, use. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, and, like, I think I don't know, I just feel like it's for how many parishes need a priest, there it's just, like, logical that a number of them are not gonna be great, and you can
Yeah. Yeah.
easily just kind of sense when you're near a priest whether they're holy or not, you know?
Mm,
And
mm,
part of that has there probably so many different factors and, it's I'm sure it's, it's I'm sure I project things onto people and it's not my place to judge the interior
mm,
of
mm.
someone else's heart, but,
Yeah.
when you're kind of w- when you're kind of worried that, like you mentioned, like people could be harmed, if the
Yeah. Yeah.
if
Yeah.
the priest isn't competent, then it's I think it's worth being healthfully skeptical
Yeah.
or no.
Yeah. And this is where, like, because so the ladder of poiesis, the framework, which I changed it from ladder of poetry to ladder of poiesis
Oh, great.
because really what I'm trying to talk about is the inherent creativity, the creative agency of humanity, because it shows up in poetry and it shows up in priesthood, and it shows up in teachers. I think because we know
Mhm.
the difference between a good teacher and a bad teacher,
Oh, absolutely.
um, and I would say that the workers of light, the logos, love, soul, can show up in any field, and and that there's a sequence of development is that needed to be that I guess that needs to be unfolded for people to get to the point where they can consciously do that. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you brought up your ladder of Poiesis. Um, for everyone who joined, thanks for being here, and you should definitely check out Isaiah's work. He's doing some good things, and hopefully we will chat again. I'm certain that we are likely to. But unless you have anything more that you'd like to add, I think that's a pretty good place to break off. It's just a delight to talk to you.
Yeah, it is. I feel like our conversations regularly end in some kind of aporia because we contemplate something quite divine and then we don't know what to do with it.
They absolutely do. They absolutely do. And you mentioned Caleb Flores's channel, CALEBFLORES, Caleb Flores. His YouTube channel. He does commentaries on fairy tales and folk tales and moral tales. And he's been interviewing people lately. He's interviewed myself, Jake Favor, Michael Declercq, and now you, I understand. So
Yeah,
check out Caleb Flores on YouTube. You can see all of us in conversation with him. Isaiah, it's good to see you.
yeah, you too. We'll speak
You
soon.
have a wonderful night or a day for you, night for me. All right.
Yeah. See you, Aaron.